Hello everyone, and welcome back to Cold Wet Warburton. It's a very cold wintry day today, and I thought that I would do another painting from the flower book that I picked up at the op shop the other day. Melbourne is still in the snap lockdown that was started a week ago. It's been extended for another week. So we're all still at home and making the most of that time that we have. Just sit around and not really do much. If you watched my previous video, you'll know that I am doing a little project where I take the inspiration from these pictures in this book that I found at the op shop and I paint my own little version. If you haven't seen that video, then head to my main profile and you'll find the video there. Anyway, today I decided I would choose this Magnolia picture. I really liked the contrast of the dark background and the white magnolia and all the interesting petals and things that were happening. And I really like magnolias. We have one magnolia in our property. It doesn't look like this though. It's like more of a traditional pink magnolia. But anyway, and same as last time, I'm painting this on a 8x10 piece of 300 GSM watercolor paper. It's a hot press watercolor paper, so it's quite smooth. And I'm just taping down the edges to make sure it doesn't curl up. And I'm also going to be using this new Himi gouache that I recently purchased. This paint has been floating around floating around YouTube for a while now. I'm a little bit late to the party, but I found out that one of my local art shops now stocks this paint, and so I thought I would buy some to give it a go. It's more of a student quality paint rather than a professional gouache paint. It's not that expensive. This whole tray was only about $40, I think. And so yeah, I thought I'd give it a go. And it has lots of paint for that money, but again, it's not the greatest quality paint, but it's still fun. Anyway, I've also watched a lot of other YouTubers use this paint, and so I have learnt from watching them that although it does look really pretty when you take all of the tops off the paints and they will just sit there nicely in the container looking all pretty, it doesn't really work from a practical standpoint because the paint does dry out really quickly. The container that it comes in, although it does has a lid that clips down, it's not totally airtight. And if you leave gouache out in the air, it will dry. And so I've had some people say that, this stuff completely dries out after about, 2 or 3 months if you don't keep it sealed properly. So I have learnt my lesson from that, and I've decided to just peel off the corner of each of these little tubs and use a spatula to pull out the paint when I need to use it. And hopefully that will stop it from drying out so quick. And although with being gouache, you can just add water to the gouache and it will totally reactivate and you can use it still even when it does dry out. But I find that I prefer to paint with gouache that is straight out of the tube consistency. This sort of like wet, creamy consistency is the way I prefer to use the gouache. I don't really like it once I have to re-wet it. It sort of goes a bit more like watercolor, and you just don't get the body and the thickness in the paint anymore when that happens. So I want to try and keep these paints as wet as possible for as long as possible. So I'm foregoing the pretty little palette that has all the nice colors in it for the sake of keeping the paints wet longer, and I'm leaving the lids on them and just peeling back when I need to use them. So I'm also using a bit of a limited palette with this painting. Even though I have heaps of colours to choose from, I'm just keeping it simple and using a limited palette. Before I get too far into starting this little painting, I have some kind of exciting news to share that I thought would be interesting for you guys. I am actually having a studio built at home. Yay! This is something that I've sort of been planning to do for quite some time, and it's actually happening. So this is the front of our property, and this is roughly where the studio is going to go. It's actually going to be a studio slash carport slash workshop. So it's going to take up this whole space, including where the boat is. And there was a shed already. You can see where that flat part is. There was already a garden shed there. And so my partner Trent and I actually spent most of last weekend disassembling that shed and moving it down to another part of our property. And there was another flat area down the bottom here. So we've moved it there. And yes, it was a struggle. And no, I don't want to do it again. So we've put it down here, and that's just our regular garden shed now. So that's going to hold like garden stuff. And anyway, the next stage before we can go too much further is to take down these two big gum trees. We need to get someone in to chop them down for us because they're a little bit too big for us to tackle on our own. And then we can progress to the next stage of building this studio, which is really exciting. So this is a really bad artist impression that I just quickly did in Procreate, just to give you a bit of a visual idea of what's happening. So as you can see, we're going to have a carport to house our boat, and then there's going to be a big building, just a typical shed with like corrugated iron and stuff, but it's going to have a workshop at the front for my partner to use because he makes the frames for my paintings, and then I'll have a studio at the back, which is really exciting. So we still have a long way to go on this though. Realistically, it's probably not going to happen and be finished until well towards the end of the year. But yeah, I will keep you guys updated with that and show some progress photos once, you know, more things start happening. So yeah, anyway, let's get into painting. So the first thing that I did was mix up a fairly, you know, watery version of this gouache. I just wanted to block in, you know, some background colour because, like, you know, I don't like painting on white. I prefer to have a bit of a base. And so I watered these paints down to make them a bit more like watercolour, to create a bit of a textured kind of background and to roughly block in some of the dark areas and light areas as well. And yeah, so I mean, and that's the great thing about using gouache. You can actually water it down and use it in a way similar to watercolour. And once that was totally dry, I was then able to come in and sort of sketch a bit more of a plan as to where things were going to go. I decided that I didn't want to completely sketch out this magnolia because I felt like I could probably represent it a lot better by focusing on the negative space around the back of it. And because there's so many petals, I didn't want to sketch in everything because I felt like that would end up making it a little bit too stiff. So I ended up just loosely sketching in where everything was going to go, and some more watery kind of shadow colours as well, just to build up the underpainting a bit before I went too much further with it. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the actual gouache that I'm using and what I think of it. I have used it a few times before I did this painting. I'd sort of done a few little tests with it and a couple of other paintings. And I'm actually pretty impressed. I can sort of see why a lot of artists on YouTube have reviewed this and sort of tried it out, and quite a lot of them use it on a regular basis. It's actually a really good quality gouache for the price and the amount of paint that you get. I'm actually pretty impressed. It's nice and smooth, it mixes really well, it blends well. I found that it does dry quite quickly on the palette, so I had to kind of re-wet it quite a lot, but you know, gouache tends to dry pretty quick anyway. The colours were really vibrant and smooth, and yeah, it's good. I also found as well that generally speaking, gouache dries pretty dark, but and that's the hard thing with gouache, is that it will dry a lot darker than what you think it is when you put it down wet, and so sometimes it can be really tricky to judge values. But I found that this actually didn't really change too much. It didn't go like really pale and chalky when it dried. So yeah, that was actually really good as well. The main reason why I chose this picture was because of that strong contrast between the background and the white magnolia. And so I actually thought that I would find it a bit easier to create the shape of the magnolia by doing some negative painting, and that's where I kind of block in the background around the petals more than painting the actual petals. So you can see here that I'm kind of blocking in the dark contrasted background and leaving the petal space there. This is negative painting. I do this a lot in my paintings, and sometimes when you've got a really complicated subject, it's actually easier to break down that subject and define that subject by painting in this way, because you're thinking a bit more about the shape rather than the complexity. So this was just the first layer of darkness that I put in, and it's not the exact colours. Like, I'm not, like usual, I'm not going for an exact realistic representation here, and I'm not going for an exact colour match. I'm just looking at the values. So I wanted the contrast from the dark to the light. That's what I was looking at here. And I blocked in most of the background area first before I went too far with everything else. When painting white flowers, the worst thing you could do is come straight in with white. You need to build up the shadows underneath everything first, because when you look at a white flower, even though it's white, when you look closely at it, there really isn't that much actual white. And so you can see that I'm actually building up the bottom layers of this white magnolia with more pinks, purples, sort of shadowy colours. And I want to make sure that I've got a lot of complexity and shadows in place before I come out and put the highlights on the flower, because the last thing I'm going to do is actually add the white, because that's like the highlight and that's what's going to give it that 3 dimension. But to start with, most of this white flower is actually more pinks and purples and greys. So now I'm just going to darken up some of the background, because again, I really want to boost that contrast, and the original blue that I put down wasn't quite dark enough. So I've kind of mixed up, this is like a really dark purple colour it looks blue, but it's actually like a really dark purple. It's a mixture of the darker blue and the reddy colour. The Himi paints don't really have colours names. They're all like labelled like numbers. So I'd say this is probably a Prussian blue and a magenta, which would be colours that I'd normally use, and that seems like to me the right kind of description of these colours. And I mix them up to make a really dark purpley blue colour just to increase some of the contrast in the dark before I come in and add the final white highlights on top of the flower, which will really push the flower forwards. While you're watching me paint, you'll probably notice that I don't focus on just one area of a painting when I'm creating it. I'm always moving around the painting. And if you want to have that loose, spontaneous kind of feeling, the worst thing you can do is just focus on one area and ignore the rest of it. Your painting, you need to think of it as a whole painting and not just different areas. So whenever I have a colour on my brush, I'm always looking around the whole painting to see where else I can put that and where else that colour will fit and that value will fit. And by doing the whole painting all in one go, you create more of a cohesive look to the painting. And yeah, I tend to find that, you won't get so fussy with the details either when you're working over the whole painting. So even when I start, adding in some details in some darkness in the background, I don't just add it to one area. I make sure that I add that darkness in wherever it needs it. When I add in a bit of the yellow, for example, or that orangey colour I just mixed up, I make sure that I don't just add that to one area of the painting and focus on one area. I make sure that I add it to other areas. And that's something that's, I think, really important to remember when you're wanting to paint in a looser style, is to think of your painting as a whole piece, not just individual areas. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. All I'm saying is, paint it as a whole. So don't focus too much on one area and forget about the rest of the painting. Now, for some reason, I forgot to record putting the highlights on the larger flower. I don't know how I managed to do that, but you can see in this just little section here that it is literally just pure white. It's like the whitest white gouache that I could possibly get, just on those top petals and where the sun would be hitting the flower. That's where I put the really strong highlights. And after that, it's just a matter of adding a few final touches, and then this painting was done. So all up, it took me probably about half an hour of painting, so I've kind of condensed that into a shorter video. And here is the satisfying tape peel, and then I will reveal the full piece. So here is the finished gouache painting of the Magnolia, and I'm pretty happy with it. Like I said, the Himi paint was actually pretty impressive, and I would definitely recommend it if you have a budget and you really don't want to spend too much on gouache. Even if you've just getting into gouache, that's probably a really good palette to start with. I find that there's a lot of colours in the palette that you don't need, but besides that, it's actually a really good quality paint. So I hope you enjoyed that video, and I hope you enjoyed watching me paint another one of these flowers. As always, make sure you check out my other videos, hit the like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to make sure that you don't miss out on any future videos. And I will see you again soon.